So let's continue talking about kind of frameworks or models to think about when we're actually trying to truly capture performance or criterion. The first one is objective versus subjective. So I'd say the first thing you want to think about is you want to identify any objective measures of performance that are in the job. Now, you're not looking for objective measures that aren't related to the job analysis or aren't important to the job. But if there are conceptual criterion, things that are important to the job, important things to measure to really get at performance, and they can be measured objectively. And again, objectively simply means that multiple people, if they looked at the data, if they looked at the information, there would be no disagreement on whether or not the number is what the number is. So objective measures can include number of days late in a month. Objective measures may include number of units with no defects created in an hour. Objective measures may be number of days missed in a certain period of time. They should be fairly objective. Now, they may also be fairly simplistic. They may be numerical accounts. So again, number of publications in a year is an objective measure. However, objective measures may not capture enough of the conceptual criterion, so we should not ignore subjective measures. Subjective measures are ones that there may be some disagreement on. So for instance, if you're wanting to determine how impactful an article was, or how positive or how good the journal that it's published in is, that may become a little more of a subjective determination. So for instance, a lot of times we may try to find another objective measure. So for example, the impact factor of a particular journal. But impact factor alone is not going to capture necessarily how many times the article is cited. So we might look at number of times the article was cited in a year. But again, was it cited in other top tier journals, or was it cited in basically theses and dissertations? So again, though the numbers may be objective, they may not be capturing what we're interested in, and we may need to look at also subjective measures. So again, when we're measuring job performance, we want to look at production. We want to look at quantity or quality of output. We want to look at personnel data, lateness, absenteeism, turnover, number of accidents, number of promotions, number of awards. But we may also need subjective, supervisor, peer, and subordinates evaluations of those performance. So again, the criticisms of objective measures over job performance is generally we do want to err on the side of trying to capture as much as we can with objective measures. But again, when we're looking at objective measures, we're wanting to ask the question, how much relevance are we capturing in the conceptual criterion? And is that objective measure also capturing deficiency, or are we also capturing potential contamination? And are there subjective measures that may fill those gaps or clarify performance for us? We also want to ask about task versus conceptual performance. So the last slide was talking about whether it's an objective or a subjective measure. Now we're asking, is it a measure of task or contextual performance? So task performance is usually directly tied to core job duties, and they're often more likely to be objective measures. However, again, if we're truly trying to get at performance, tasks alone may not capture the entirety of the conceptual criterion. We may need also contextual behavior or contextual performance, including organizational citizenship behaviors, behaviors that help create a good work environment, and potentially also the absence of counterproductive work behaviors. So again, you may want to do a little thought exercise of what are some of the OCBs that might be displayed by a graduate student. And one of the first places you could look at is actually our contextual performance that we measure approximately once a semester on our students. The second page of that performance page is OCBs, such things as enthusiasm, conscientiousness, and again, these aren't necessarily directly related to your task, getting A's on your paper, getting A's in classes, but may also still be an important part of your performance as a graduate student. So another way to kind of conceptualize the expansion of the criterion domain is to be thinking about that the first thing we probably want to measure is we want to ask, can we get to objective measures of task performance? So that's the first thing we're going to kind of focus on. Can we get productivity measures? Can we get absenteeism, lateness, and turnover? And how important are those to the job? Now again, the value of objective task performance will also be somewhat determined in the nature of the job. The more complex the job is, the more creative the job is, the less likely you're going to have very clear measures of objective task performance. And even if you have them, they may have a lot of deficiency at actually capturing performance. Then we want to add subjective task performance. So again, we're looking at actual tasks that are related to the job, but we're trying to capture that deficiency that the objective measures may not have captured. So it may be supervisor ratings, self-ratings, peer ratings, subordinate ratings, and customer and client ratings. And finally, after we've measured tasks, we want to ask, are there extra contextual performances that can be measured either objectively or subjectively? Generally speaking, contextual performances are tending towards subjective measures, but they may include ratings of extra effort, civic virtue, supporting the organization, loyalty to the organization, the lack of counterproductive behaviors such as stealing small items, or time theft. In other words, while on the clock doing things that are not necessary to the organization's goals. We want to think about all of these if we're truly trying to objectively and subjectively create a decent measure of performance. We also want to recognize the difference between typical versus maximal measures of performance. So a maximum measure of performance is what someone could do if highly motivated for a short duration. A lot of times what we find is when we are measuring performance, especially if we're trying to validate a selection method, we may actually tell people we want to measure your performance for the purposes of creating a criterion to determine selection. Now people know that they're going to be measured for a short period of time. They're likely to do maximum performance. They're going to work really hard. They're going to try to do a really good job. Typical performance, though, is what we're actually interested in. And that's one of the reasons why, again, ideally, we already want a performance measure system fully in place and fully functioning, because that performance appraisal system that's already in place and functioning is more likely to capture typical performance. What people actually do on the job, performance over extended periods of time when motivation is less constrained. In other words, how do people perform day after day over a month versus how people perform in a 2-hour test? Usually, typical and maximal performance are not highly correlated when we actually have both. So recognize that if you're trying to validate a selection battery, a series of tests that are used to predict if someone's going to perform well in the organization does not already have an existing performance of typical performance, you're probably going to have to come up with some kind of spot check of current employees to find out how they actually perform. And that performance by its nature is probably going to be getting closer to maximum performance, not typical performance. Now, you may not have an absolute solution to this, but you can at least be aware of the problem and ask, is there any way I can get closer to typical performance in my measure of their performance compared to a short duration measure that they know they're being measured on for maximal performance. A lot of times in organizations, when we're actually getting our hands dirty in the practice of IO psychology, these kind of models are what we want to fall back on to make sure we're still bringing science into it. And it's not necessarily that we're going to be an annoying impediment that insists that we have a typical measure of performance, but we can at least ask, are there things I can do to at least alleviate or reduce the problem of the fact that I'm being forced to measure maximum performance when I'd rather measure typical performance. We also want to decide how exactly we're measuring performance, depending again on what we're using it for. So composite performance is we're going to create a single index. So we may be measuring multiple conceptual criterions with our actual criterions, but at the end of the day, we're going to collapse those into a single score. We're going to rank order people from worst performer to best performer. And this is often needed for decision making. This is needed for promotions. This is needed to identify those that might need additional training. However, if what we're wanting to use the criterion for, the measure of performance, is detailed feedback of how the person could do better, we probably want multiple criteria. We want to keep them separate. We want to talk about what the person's doing well versus areas they may struggle. And often it is difficult to combine, especially again in complex and creative jobs, various dimensions in a meaningful way. So for instance, how do you combine teaching, service, and research and really get to a composite score that also captures if there's a problem or not in any of those particular elements? So again, teaching evaluations would be an example of this. When you do a teaching evaluation, you usually are actually filling out multiple questions about the person's teaching, including the structure of their class, the assignments, the reading materials. However, if you're actually measuring overall performance, we're either going to collapse all of that into a single average, or there may be an item at the end of the questions that says, overall, how well is this person teaching? That would be an example of a composite score. However, the individual items are what actually gives us some detail of what people are liking or disliking in our class that results in that composite score. So again, it kind of depends. Are you making a decision on this data, or are you using it for developmental purposes? Both of them may change how you actually look at the criterion and the information that you have. So Campbell did create a taxonomy of performance, and this is a pretty good one to think about. And the idea here is that it's a list of potential conceptual criterion that you need to capture if you're trying to truly measure performance in a job. The bold items are ones that all jobs require. The non-bolded ones are jobs that may or may not need to be measured. So the first one is job-specific task proficiency. Can you actually do the job? So if you have a measure of performance that does not measure whether the person actually does the core tasks as defined by the definition of the job and defined by the job analysis, then you clearly have deficiency. You're not measuring a core thing that you need to measure to get at performance. You also need to measure demonstrating effort, whether or not they actually do the tasks. So just because they can do the task doesn't mean they are doing the tasks. So the first and fourth of Campbell's taxonomy of performance are important factors, and you need to make sure that you're capturing both if you're truly wanting to capture performance. Now the next two may or may not be needed depending on the type of job, and again, the complexity of the job, and you can use the job analysis hopefully to guide these decisions. So one of them is non-job specific task proficiency. So tasks not specifically related to a particular job, but tasks that if you do and you know how to do, you generally are helping others to do their job well, or are providing additional services above and beyond your job that help the organization. Written and oral communication skills, so proficiency in writing and speaking. And again, if your job truly entails a major part of presentations, oral communication, or written communication, then you need to make sure that you're measuring this. So these are the first four, and again, two of them may or may not be important to jobs. Two of them almost have to be measured if you truly want to make a claim that you're getting at performance. So continuing the taxonomy, we have four more. And another one, again, is in bold, maintaining personal discipline. So the avoidance of negative behaviors, substance abuse, absenteeism, time theft. Basically, again, if we have someone who knows how to do the job and is doing the job, but also spends a fair amount of their time not doing their job or stopping others from successfully doing their job, we need to capture that as well. In other words, we're looking for the absence of the negative behaviors or the positive that they maintain their own personal discipline within the role. They take their job seriously, they respect the company, and they're loyal to the company. Now, these other items, again, will depend on the job. Facilitating peer and team performance. So for managers, this is going to be an important section that we need to measure, including also supervision. So supervising, managing employees, and finally management and administration. And notice all three of these are somewhat different. Facilitating peer and team performance may actually be done by either a manager or not a manager. But it is a situation where you're good at, if your job involves you working with teams and working with peers to get a job done and working on problems, we need to capture that in our measure of performance. If you actually are a manager, your supervision skills need to be measured. And again, if you're a manager, you may need your actual administrative skills measured. So your management behaviors outside of direct supervision. So again, Campbell's taxonomy of performance is 8 items, at least that we've gone over so far, and they're the core 8 that you want to think about. Do I need to measure this? And if I do, how do I measure it? So again, multidimensional criteria in HR decisions. Decisions on how to treat multiple criteria should be based on the purpose, and I already kind of talked about this. There's 2 types. There's developmental or psychological understanding, in which we really want to attend to the multiple criteria and the multiple ratings. And then there's decision making with an economic focus, where we probably need to figure out a way to come up with a single criterion score from those multiple dimensions. Most applied psychologists should use the weighted composite to make hiring decisions and use the multiple dimensions to understand the relationship with better predictors and to provide feedback. So again, what you're using your criterion for, your measure of performance, does guide how you treat it. So again, the characteristics of an appropriate criterion measure. So just putting this all together. First is a lack of contamination. We want to make sure that we're not capturing bias or error, if at all possible, in the way we're measuring performance. We want to make sure that our actual criterion are relevant. The percentage of variance estimated in the ultimate criteria or the conceptual criteria accounted for by the actual criteria. We also want to make sure it's practical. So we haven't talked about this yet, but again, we could have a very good set of performance measures that are relevant and do not contain contamination, but are not practical. They will not be used by decision makers. They are too complex, they take too much time, and they get rejected. And again, this is that balance between what we should do, the science of measuring performance, and what we can actually do, getting people to use it. We do need to make sure that once we have a practical and relevant and free of contamination measure of performance, that it still has some sensitivity or it can discriminate. So the extent to which the criterion does distinguish between effective and ineffective performers. It needs to be reliable. In other words, if we're claiming we're measuring performance, we need to make sure we actually are measuring performance. And finally, it needs to have fairness. So the extent to which employees perceive it to be just and fair. In other words, once we have a good measure of performance that's reliable, sensitive, practical, and relevant and free of contamination, we also need to sell the people that are going to be assessed with it that it's truly capturing their job performance. And they need to buy in and believe it's just and fair. And again, that has little to do with the actual science of it. That has to do with the practice of it. And finally, we do want to ask the question of each measure or multidimensional measure of performance that we're using, that it's also controllable. In other words, we don't want to be measuring static state traits in people as a measure of performance. So if your measure of performance is including actual traits of the person, personality traits, cognitive ability traits, that's not necessarily something they control. Measures of performance should be about controllable behaviors that relate to success in the job.